Our next panel is on access and accessibility, which I hope will continue some of the themes that were brought up during yesterday's sessions as well as this morning. And to lead us through this discussion is Bethany Wiggin, who is the founding director of the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities at the University of Pennsylvania, where she is an associate professor of German and a member of the graduate groups in English and comparative literature. Her scholarship explores histories of migration, ecology, language, and cultural translation since the Columbian Exchange on both sides of the Atlantic world. She experiments in her writing and teaching with new models of public research practices that can engage audiences across and beyond the academy at a time of rapid ecological change. Her work endeavors to create open and connected knowledge communities and Her work endeavors to create open and connected knowledge communities and often features collaborations with artists and scientists. Projects have been featured on the PBS NewsHour, CBS Evening News, CNN, The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, Vice, The Washington Post, The New York Times, Science Friday, and others. Ongoing collaborative public projects include Data Refuge, an Ecotopian Toolkit, and Rising Waters. Her capacity-building work has been supported by major grants from the Mellon Foundation and the National Geographic Foundation. She has been a Whiting Public Engagement Fellow and was honored by the Union of Concerned Scientists with their Science Defender Award. Bethany.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thank you especially to Patrick Sparrow for inviting me to be here. You just took away my notes. Thank you so much. Talk about disappearing records. It's such a pleasure to be here today and to join you in this very exciting conference. We decided that we were going to introduce each of the panelists. Her slide. Okay, so Dorothy is going to go first. And I'm going to introduce each of them before they give their brief talks of their much longer and rich papers. Dorothy Berry is the Digital Collections Program Manager at the Houghton Library at Harvard. She received a Master of Library Science and Master of Arts in Ethnomusicology from Indiana University, focusing on historic ethnography and digital archives. Before coming to the Houghton, she served as metadata and digitization lead for University of Minnesota's Umbra Search African American History program, where she was able to continue her work of promoting access to African American history from earlier stints at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the Black Film Center Archive, and the Archives of African American Music and Culture. Dorothy.
Thank you. As said, I am Dorothy Berry, and my presentation today, Take Me into the Library and Show Me Myself Towards Authentic Accessibility in Libraries, will focus on some obstacles in making digitized rare books and manuscripts genuinely discoverable or authentically accessible, as I love alliterations, and these obstacles that were crystallized over the course of a 2-year project at University of Minnesota, digitizing African American archival materials across University of Minnesota collections. Take me into the museum and show me myself. Show me my people, show me soul America. If you cannot show me myself, if you cannot teach my people what they need to know, and they need to know the truth, and they need to know that nothing is more important than human life, if you cannot show and teach these things, then why shouldn't I attack the temples of America and blow them up? This quote, spoken by June Jordan during the height of the late 1960s move towards more representative museum collections, resonates today with rare books and archival collections. There's widespread discomfort around this primarily white profession stewarding primarily white collections for primarily white audiences. A current strain of thought in librarianship has said that digitizing materials, putting them on the democratized internet, is a sufficient move to increase access outside of a collection's traditional patronage. The act of putting a digital object online does increase access, but I would argue that that first level of increased reach is not enough. Moving towards an authentic accessibility, and accessibility based on the pursuit of underrepresented patrons and the promotion of marginalized collections, requires more than a catalog link to a IIIF viewer. I will be discussing two related projects out of the University of Minnesota that have pursued the goal of authentic accessibility through an improved front end, UmbraSearch African American History, the website, and Digitizing African American Archival Materials Across University of Minnesota Collections. Such a long title. A clear-funded hidden collections grant on which I served as metadata and digitization lead. UmbraSearch, the brainchild of the collections, the Givens Collection of African American Literature at U of M, is a site designed to provide an easy search functionality to an ever-growing aggregation of digitized archival and special collections material related to African American history and culture. The two strongest features of the UmbraSearch site are the user experience and the subject area curation. The familiar front page with a centralized search bar and recommended searches mirrors the type of search engine with which most people are familiar today. The site is focused on its singular goal and lacks both a .uofm.edu URL and a paywall. These decisions were not made by chance, but with the goal of feeling as welcome to an Ivy League college freshman as to a junior high student in rural Minnesota, as to a cultural heritage volunteer in South Carolina. By removing the academic .edu from the website, we hoped to pass the barrier that people just have an intellectual feeling of gatekeeping. And although there is the benefits of working with something like Adams-Matthew to get African American collections digitized, that makes them accessible to people that have Adams-Matthew logins, which relates back to this idea of authentic accessibility rather than literal accessibility if you pay enough tuition. And then the curation kind of speaks for itself. By working towards a search strategy that only aggregates materials related to African American history, the site moves towards a more comfortable accessibility, removing the barriers of presumed foreknowledge of how and where to search to find the already proportionally small amount of African American materials in a given collection. Digitizing African American Archival Materials Hidden Collections project dealt with the other side of the access coin. So the UmbraSearch can be the front end, and this project is more of the back end. Site had been built to aggregate African American materials, but how does that address the number of large and/or important institutions who feel they just don't have any African American collections to speak of? Digitizing African American Archival Materials was a non-traditional look at hidden collections that sought to address this issue. University of Minnesota and the state of Minnesota itself are not broadly associated with African American history, but working under the general theory that any large holding of rare books and special collections materials related to African American history, related to American history by their very nature, contain African American materials. This project set out to digitize all African American materials in the archives and special collections, regardless of if those collections were perceived to have any collection development policy that would have brought in African American materials. While the project was objectively a success with over 500,000 new TIFFs created in 7,000 new digital objects, each with its own enhanced descriptive record, the process of identifying the materials, digitizing the materials, writing new descriptive metadata, and then exporting the digital objects illuminated 3 ongoing obstacles to making this sort of material more broadly accessible online. Since the papers were distributed beforehand, I'm going to focus on these 3 obstacles as I think they're perhaps the most interesting for further discussion. I have summarized these issues as limited resources for archival processing, conventions around arrangement and description, and a lack of transferable documentation. And although this focuses somewhat on archival practices most heavily, a lot of the issues cross over with rare books as well. So the limited processing allowance, the high level of processing versus item level access. We have moved to very high level processing in archives with the idea that the more we get finding aids out there, the more people can see these materials, which is true if those people come and visit the archive. But when people are looking for things online, they're accessing at the item level. They're searching for that discrete record. And what if that discrete record has the description that was given to an entire box? So these policies are designed for speed and also for the cost savings. And those decisions are made at the highest levels of libraries. This minimal processing leads to digital objects with very generalized descriptions. And then paper-focused arrangement and description, which is really an extension of the first issue. The way that we're describing our materials and arranging them is a focus on hierarchy and original order that has a lot of meaning if you're looking through a finding aid to then ask for a physical folder. That meaning has less if you do a search by keywords and you're brought a ton of folders and you are not looking in archive space, you don't know the hierarchy, and maybe that's not something that has any meaning for you as a user anyway. Those physical folders, which people browse through and visualize physically as item level, become complex objects where perhaps the 3 photos featuring African Americans in a folder of 500 pictures no longer has meaning. And then based on these assumptions of physical discovery. Paper-based arrangement and description creates obfuscated digital objects that no longer provide any sort of true description of what's inside of this folder. And then a lack of transferable documentation, which can be summarized with what I think of as mental metadata. Information that does not go into finding aids, doesn't go into catalog records, because we know our reference librarians know this information. And if you were to come and talk to them, they could give you fantastic information, which is undoubtedly true. Every reference librarian and curator I've worked at, every institution I've worked at, has been a wellspring of information about their particular holdings. But that has nothing to do with our users online who are just searching and maybe could do a reference request, but that assumes a sort of scholarly insight and a sort of feeling of access that doesn't always exist. So to close, these obstacles are by no means insurmountable. A move towards thoughtful and authentic accessibility, however, means resetting the popular, if we digitize it, they will come mentality that leads to the same sort of gatekeeping that has kept people from feeling physically comfortable in our spaces, being directly transferred to our digital surrogates. Authentic accessibility means moving beyond a transfer of tradition and towards a total rethinking of how and why we put things online in the first place. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Jennifer Rossmann. She is the director of the Department of Area Studies and Humanities Research Support at the Yale University Library. There, she leads a team of 13 subject specialists in collection development, instruction, and outreach. Her department supports teaching, learning, and research for over 500 faculty and 1,600 graduate and undergraduate students. Previously, and for over 15 years, she was the head of special collection at the Yale Arts Library, where she acquired artist books and artist archives, taught with primary sources, led the exhibition and outreach programs, and revitalized the programming around the library's historic 1839 Albion Iron Hand Press. Jay holds a BA in Art and Art History from St. Mary's College of Maryland, a post-bac certificate in painting and printmaking from Brandeis, an MS in Library and Information Science from Simmons, and an MA in Modern History and Literature from Drew University. She's currently a PhD candidate in Library and Information Science at Simmons University, formerly Simmons College. Jay.
So thank you for the introduction, and thank you also to the APS for the wonderful opportunity to be here today and to share the beginnings of what I hope will be an extended research project on changing attitudes towards access to special collections in academic libraries. I'm really looking forward to everyone's feedback. So I started this project actually out of doing background research about the history of special collections in general, and there were a couple of surprises that led me to this project. So the first was that setting up administratively separate rare book collections in the academic library is primarily a 20th century phenomenon, even though there are places like the APS that go back many more decades. or even centuries. And additionally, when I started reading the literature from the early part of the 20th century, I was surprised by some of the attitudes that were expressed. So I'm going to forego a recap of the background portion of my paper today, but I just wanted to point out that it's been well covered by some of the other excellent papers here at the conference. But one occurrence I do want to draw particular attention to is that the rise in women becoming professionally trained librarians in the beginning of the 20th century coincided with the administrative creation of separate rare book rooms. The predominantly male scholars of the rare book world were known as bookmen, and they became the heads of these newly separate rare book rooms, while professional librarians were primarily in the general collections in the early to mid-20th century. The literature about the rare book department in academic libraries, written primarily by bookmen, seems to indicate that there was a disconnect and perhaps even a conflict or competition between ideas of access in general collections and special collections, then known as rare book rooms. In 1937, Randolph Adams penned the essay, "Librarians as Enemies of Books," published in Library Journal. This essay is cited by Sidney Berger as the beginning of the literature on rare book rooms published by those in the profession. And the competition, I think, is apparent with the quips that you can see on the screen. In other words, no scholarly knowledge is needed to work with books when one is a librarian. And these comments are not directly about access, but it's part of the underlying attitude that informs access decisions. And now I'll jump a few decades into the 1970s and the first official statements on access by the Rare Book and Manuscript section of ACRL. For the purposes of this paper, I focused on the rare book part of special collections, but I want to make sure to acknowledge the important contribution that archivists made and are still making to ideas of access. So this selected timeline is trying to underscore the point that I want to make about how the development of professional guidelines signal a change in attitudes. Both SAA and RBMS were in existence for decades before they issued professional statements. So what prompted this? My initial investigations led to these questions. So why did professional organizations feel the need to specify that access should not be restricted except for legal reasons? And does the creation of these statements imply that access was previously not egalitarian? While I covered this only briefly in the paper, I have looked at the changes in language in each of the statements closely. And it will not surprise you to learn that the language becomes more inclusive of all types of library users over time, or we could also look at it as being less restrictive. One aspect of access that I would like to draw our attention to today is the use of technology. In the earliest statements, providing description of materials and making those descriptions available through the appropriate technology, so for example, catalog cards becoming OPAC records, was considered a responsibility of a library or archives professional. In the earliest statements, the term qualified reader was used, and I think this marks a transitional moment. The professional organizations felt the need to produce an official statement outlining ideas on access, yet the statement reflected the older idea of a qualified reader. Who was that qualified reader? What qualifications were necessary to gain access to collections? And most importantly, who had the authority to vet those qualifications? To answer these questions, I turned to literature before the official access statements to see what was revealed. And I did find the expected statements about how distinguished scholars should be using these distinguished collections. But there were two other things that were surprising to me. In the 1930s, Lawrence Clark Powell wrote that rare book rooms should be used by undergraduates and that the material should not be sequestered from use. And this is now a dominant idea, but it was a surprise to find it 80 years ago alongside the more restrictive views on access. The other surprise to me was the rivalry between the bookmen of the rare book world and professional librarians that punctuated writings in the 30s, 40s, and even into the 50s, as I mentioned previously. I started my investigation looking specifically at the Library Trends issue devoted to rare books, libraries, and collections in 1957. Reading this set of articles is what inspired me to look at citation networks. When I was reading, I got a strong sense of the same names coming up repeatedly, but how could I see that? So data visualization seemed like the right tool. So here's the visualization of the citation network specifically for that issue, Library Trends 1957, and I've left the names off so we can clearly see the relationships. What I expected to see is what's happening in the middle of the visualization, in that there are multiple arrows pointing to the same node and even sometimes reciprocal arrows happening. The surprise was the constellations of nodes surrounding a central node, and that this was a common pattern. Not only did this exercise help me verify that the bookmen were citing each other, but I came to see a pattern of how they were also name droppers, for lack of a better term. When they discuss a specific subject, they frequently list an extensive amount of examples, as if trying to connect themselves into a network by demonstrating their knowledge of it. For me, this pattern showed evidence of a trend that was known colloquially in the profession, that of the old boys network. And one can imagine that the bookmen who were part of this tight network were not necessarily open to just anyone using the rare materials they stewarded. This strong sense of professional camaraderie was likely the reason that Powell reversed his opinions on the use of rare books. When he was advocating their use by undergraduates in 1939, he was a junior librarian working in the Central Acquisitions Department of UCLA, and not yet an insider to the rare book world. A decade later, he had completely reversed his position and even renounced his earlier work. And he was also the university librarian and the head of the Clark Library at UCLA, so now very much an insider. I added in articles from 1937 to 1965, and just to be clear, these are articles that I've found so far, so not an all-inclusive set of the literature by any means. But we can see that the pattern is continuing. So I found, in particular, I'll just draw your attention to the one at the top. Let's see if I can get this to work, up here in orange. This one I found especially amusing because this was an author who was talking about the history of collecting, and he cited over 200 names, many of which do connect into the rest of the network, as you'll see. In the literature of the 1960s, we see a change in attitudes about who should be using rare book collections, with notables such as Marjorie Wynne saying that she wants to combat the idea, quote, that everything therein is to be gazed upon but not touched, end quote. And the professional statements on access follow in the 1970s, as we discussed earlier. So here I'll come back to the themes of technology and of undergraduate use of special collections to close out my remarks. With the explosion of new technology from the 1970s forward, both in access and preservation, technology was a topic that dominated the literature on rare books, and which is now increasingly called special collections in that time period. Additionally, from the late 1990s to the present, there's a growing body of literature about undergraduate use of special collections. Of note is that in the early days, the articles focused on why it was beneficial for undergraduates to use special collections, and later the articles focused on how best to use the collections, because undergraduates had become a typical audience, not an exception. Likewise, with articles on technology, as time goes by, there is more of a focus on how to use the technology to increase access and less of a focus on who should have this access that is being facilitated by the technology. From the 1970s forward, there's also an interesting line of discussion about increasing the use of special collections because use statistics were needed to administratively justify the operation. So while ideals of who should have access to these materials were becoming more inclusive, there was also an underlying administrative need for expanded access. So to summarize, from my investigation, it appears that a combination of the importance of access as a core element of librarianship and larger societal trends toward equal access to institutional resources, as well as economic pressures and pedagogical changes in academia, that's the part I didn't summarize in the beginning, drove the change in special collections from a club-like environment to the service and education-oriented departments of today. But we can't simply look at these changes as a clear trajectory from closed to open-mindedness. There were those who wanted the materials to be used more widely from early on, But likewise, there are still considerable barriers to the use of special collections, as we've heard many times so far during this conference. So while there has been significant change over the last century, I'm just putting in my additional plug that I hope the special collections community continues to work to look for ways to increase access to its collections. And I think that the dialogue we're having here is an important part of that, and thank you again for the opportunity to contribute to it.
Rounding out our trio of papers is Scott Matheson. Scott is Associate Law Librarian for Technical Services at the Lillian Goldman Library at the Yale Law School. He oversees library technical services, including acquisitions, serials control, cataloging, and electronic resource management. He has experience in both public and technical services, including as reference and government documents librarian at Yale Law Library and as head of public services at the University of Colorado Wise Law Library. He served on the Depository Library Council from 2014 until last year.
Thank you very much. A quick note for those who read the paper, where I refer to the Depository Library Act of 1968. That was an editing mistake on my part. It should be 1962, so just back that up 6 years in your mind, closer to the middle of the century. And thanks to Marie Colcannon from the University of Missouri for her very close read and editing help. The faults are, of course, entirely my own, but I'm grateful to her. I'm happy to talk about the arcane but fascinating topic of codification and reenactment into positive law if you want at another time. I'll talk a little bit about the past of government information, just to dip back into yesterday for a moment. For background, there's more in the paper and others have written about it in far more detail than I. But for this morning, I'll mostly focus on the present transition to the increasing production of born digital electronic government information, mostly at the federal level, mostly in the United States, because it has the most impact on access by both contemporary and our future researchers. We heard yesterday that librarians should be telling stories about our collections, about our users. And here's one that government documents librarians, government information professionals love to tell. Note that it intersects with Dr. Matthews' discussion yesterday about collections, the moral acts, and the growth of our libraries and higher education. So here's the story. Since the early 19th century, since 1813, our government has disseminated information to our libraries for the use of the public. This system preserved the published documents of our democracy through geographic distribution, and it made them available to the public for no fee. So good, one might even say authentic for the time, access. Now they're available because of this to digitize and to make further accessible and do interesting computational things with, right? So we have this historic collection, and that's a great story. The real story is, and if you've worked in a depository library, you know this. This is all highly imperfect for reasons too dull to go into now. But the bulk of the information is preserved. It is reasonably accessible, more so every day, and we mostly know what we have. It's described. Problematically, but described. Because of the scale of the distribution over time, if things were distributed, another if, we can probably find them and get them to our users, to our researchers. This story begins to change, whether the happy sunshine version that we like to tell or the reality, and change at an increasing rate, sometime around, we'll say 1994, in part because the 1994 GPO Access Act acknowledged pretty early, if you think 1994, this is pretty early, the government acknowledged the transition to digital accessibility of government information. Access is right there in the name, GPO Access. The other thing that starts to change in the 1990s, and again, some of you think back, and accelerates over time, is digital production of information, of documents. production outside of GPO's traditional workflows, outside of agency publication offices or officers who know about the statutory obligation to deposit their publications with GPO so that they can be described and distributed. This moves the document production outside of GPO. Documents are not captured, and they become, as somebody else has used the same term, fugitive documents. This problem affected both print and electronic or digital documents. But the important thing to note is that although they were fugitive, they still looked like documents. We still sort of recognized what they were, and as we came across them, we could turn them in. We could get GPO to catalog them. We could add them to our collections. To bring us up to today, this year, last year, 5 years ago, a more recent and potentially troubling change is from digital things that look like publications, so we know what those look like, to digital things that do not. Here you might think of things like data sets. These non-document things, information dissemination products in the unwieldy catch-all language of a pending House bill, present technical challenges. Think preserving a Flash-based website or an interactive mapping tool, the things that do keep us up at night, as one of yesterday's presenters said. These technical challenges need attention. They need resources, but they're not insurmountable. Here, if we had time, we could either have either or both a conversation about technical and sociological implications of things like data refuge, the end-of-term harvest, improvements to the Heritrix harvesting software. We could go on, and so forth. But for now, let's focus on the more troubling situation for access to modern government information, which is that these information dissemination products can fall into a policy gap, where they don't look like things that GPO should capture and preserve, documents or publications, and they're not scheduled necessarily by agencies as permanent records that should be transferred to the National Archives and Records Administration for safekeeping and eventual access. The real trouble for access here is that even when the records aren't lost, when they're transferred to NARA, they may not be immediately available or easily accessible. Archives are different, record schedules have their own progression. A given website may actually disappear from the web when the agency takes it down. This is clearly a loss of access, it's a problem. However, the producing agency may have properly scheduled and transferred the record to NARA. The information is not lost, in fact, it's well preserved. But there's definitely a loss of access, or perhaps more properly, a perceived loss of access. It may not be reasonable to expect researchers to follow this maze of government agencies to find the information they need or that may be useful to them, and depending on the schedule, it may not be available to them in a timely fashion. This is definitely a barrier to authentic access, as Dorothy calls it. These access problems stem from the changed nature and channels of government information dissemination. The new forms of information dissemination product are falling outside the systems designed for documents and records. On the bright side, this seems to be at least partly a case of policy and procedure not keeping pace with technological change. Research thus far suggests that these shortcomings aren't the result of malicious agency staff, so they can be improved by policy changes and training, including the pending Depository Library Improvement Act of 2018, and observers agree, library associations agree, it is an improvement mostly, HR 5305. The goal of the PEGI project, it's a IMLS-funded grant with participation from the University of North Texas and the Center for Research Libraries, and their December national forum that we'll be holding is to get stakeholders to formulate a national agenda for preserving the increasing amount of born digital government information for access by our researchers. At the federal level, there are strong partners in GPO, NARA, LC, and the depository library community. The forum participants will be stakeholders, including researchers, journalists, libraries and archives, publishing agencies, and policy advocates. They will develop, the goal is, they will develop a common vocabulary, shared goals, and defined outcome measures to help coordinate work in individual institutions at almost any scale, from small or simple efforts to complex harvesting and large repositories. The measures can apply to new projects or to existing projects and should work for state or local government information projects as well. This shared agenda, this move towards a collective impact model, will enable all of our institutions to work together, strengthening preservation of today's government information to ensure access for the researchers of tomorrow. Thank you.
So Patrick and Adriana asked me to speak for about 8 minutes, and I see here on the handy dandy clock I have 10, but I think I'm going to keep to 8. After which I'm going to invite the 3 panelists to respond to one another's remarks and papers, as well as to any thoughts that you may have, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. So let me get this out of the way right away at this conference about 275 years of libraries, hashtag 275 libraries. I'm not a librarian, nor an archivist for that matter, but my work frequently gives me cause to collaborate with them, with stewards of special collections, including maps and rare books and manuscripts, as well as with curators of repositories of born digital materials. Some months ago, I had the good fortune to give a short talk at the annual meeting of the Association for Research Libraries for library directors. And in fact, I started that talk with the same statement: I'm not a librarian, although I did work as an undergraduate at Swarthmore College's McCabe Library for 4 years, forgiving everyone's library fines. That talk for ARL presented a volunteer archiving and storytelling project that I'm involved in, Data Refuge, and it was bookended by talks by bona fides archivist Nancy McGovern of MIT and bona fide library directors Carton Rogers of my own University of Pennsylvania and Ann Kenny of Cornell, now both recently emerita. We prepared together for our sequence talks, and last night, while I was thinking further about our gathering today, I dug up my notebook in which I had scribbled notes of our meetings, in which I attempted to explain Data Refuge's archiving and storytelling initiatives, awkwardly aware in those phone calls of my own lack of expertise about archiving. My notes register a comment, it was either by Nancy or Anne, that can help us tease out connections between the 3 papers we've just heard, and which I have enjoyed reading and thinking with these last couple of weeks. In library land, my notebook records with cartoon-like strokes, preservation is often thought against access, or access endangers preservation. Although laboring in the same yoke, they pull against one another. My notebook also evidences a lot of exclamation points around this point, no doubt so banal to you bona fide librarians and archivists here today, but its cartoonish clarity points towards inherited structures of cultural preservation and information access, which are very much at the heart of all 3 of the papers and presentations we just heard. My own research and teaching habits have been centrally formed by the Penn libraries, many of whose amazing librarians I see in the audience today. And it's at the Penn libraries where, thanks to rare book stewards, including Dan Traister, whose work so prominently figured in one of our papers, as well as stewards such as John Pollock, Lynn Farrington, and Will Noel, and Betsy Bates, that I have little immediate cause in my own career to experience tensions between access and preservation. My students, too, got to see and handle special collections, and they continue to do so. And while we have our classes and seminars frequently in our rare book and manuscript library, the Kislak Center, we not infrequently encounter elementary kids, sometimes being read to by our head of special collections, Will, who you'll hear from later. It is a place where access and preservation belong together. It is also a place where some of the bookmen who feature in J. Rossman's paper appear, a coterie of men, usually white and wealthy, whose scholarship figures an echo chamber of their own rarefied voices. Jay's citation maps that she showed you show their fondness for mutual citation. Sure of their own status as researchers, they had little concern for their access, or for access of others beyond their own tight circle. But researchers come, as my colleagues in the Penn Libraries and beyond have taught me. They come in many sizes, shapes, genders, and colors. And the changing face of research also means that we're changing what it means to do research, its methods, its practices, and its habits. As poet June Jordan wrote in a quote that you also, we heard as the title of Barry's paper, quote, "The people who hold the power and the people who count pennies and the people who hold the keys better start thinking it all over again." Barry's paper, like June Jordan, and like researchers who don't look like traditional bookmen, and like our panel as a whole, ask, or in fact demand, that we reconsider what authentic accessibility means, and so too reconsider accessibility's relationship to preservation. In 2006, sociologist Arjuna Appadurai published a remarkable essay called The Right to Research. And in considering access and authentic accessibility with you this morning, I'd like to let it resound. Quote, "All human beings are researchers, since all human beings make decisions that require them to make systematic forays beyond their current knowledge horizons. This is especially so in a world of rapid change, where markets, media, and migration have destabilized secure knowledge niches and have rapidly made it less possible for ordinary citizens to rely on knowledge drawn from traditional, customary, or local sources." Close quote. Since Appadurai's 2006 essay, these changes are accelerating. In clip 2, with the increase in the rate of climate change and rising waters steadily remaking the ground, literally and metaphorically, below our feet. These changes are felt too in the world of government information, as Matheson's paper documents. Traditionally, he writes, quote, "Libraries and the GPO provided access to documents published by the government, while archives, chiefly NARA and its predecessor agencies, provide access to records of the government," close quote. And he continues, "As the line between publication and record has become less clear, at least to those creating the information, access has been threatened because agencies do not always clearly define them," close quote. This blurry line between publication and record parallels the blur between information producer and consumer, between research and record. And all of this points to the ways that access and preservation figure in a very different relationship in the digital age, where ensuring access is key to preservation. In other words, we'll need to rethink with Appadurai who is a researcher, and so who needs access. But also we need to think more expansively about who is a preserver, or more precisely, the connective communities of libraries plus that we need to preserve electronic government information, no less than our cultural heritage more broadly. In closing, I'd like to finish with some thoughts that my current students, 12 bright-eyed, brave students, are sending to you. They're participating in an experimental seminar cross-listed across 6 departments, nobody knows what to do with us, called Liquid Histories and Floating Archives. We're considering together how climate changes history and the kinds of archives and collections we will need to create and to preserve. We're thinking with the spotty historical and poor data records for the tidal stretch of Philadelphia's Schuylkill River. One artist project we are working with is animator and sculptor Jacob Rifkin's Floating Archives. This Floating Archives included a series of performances which projected archival images of the Schuylkill on a screen that spanned 2 canoes and was paddled upstream, quite large. The images were projected onto the places that they formerly illustrated, and it's student researcher Samantha Frisky's thoughts that I'd like to close with before inviting our speakers to respond to one another's work and to this comment before providing you open access to the conversation. Samantha wrote, "The Floating Archives experience reminds me that data documenting or preservation is a community effort, especially in the wake of the 2016 election. Truly, she writes, floating archives was a community effort, including Rifkin and those who helped him float his art up the river, making archival materials accessible through artwork, sharing the history of Philadelphia through animated projections, and in turn, passersby sharing their thoughts with the public through social media. So Samantha's thoughts, like those of our three panelists, ask us how we will think and rethink access and preservation together in connected ways. And now I'll turn it over to you.
I guess I'll start. One of the things I was thinking about with your papers, especially the opening quote, made me think about the relationship between museums and libraries that we all talk about needs to be increased. And again, when I was in the beginning stages of my project, I had read a book called Mounting Frustration. I think the subtitle is The Art Museum in the Age of Black Power, written by Susan Kahan, and it talks about the fight to, through case studies in New York City about how African-American artists were trying to be represented. And that's what sort of got me thinking, well, that was a very public fight because those were public institutions, but what was happening in rare books and special collections that were that were less public, that were inside our other institutions, and that seemed to take longer, right? Because this was happening in the 60s and into the 70s, and it seemed like it took longer for libraries to respond to those same kinds of impulses. And it feels like at this conference that while we're all trying ways to open things up, we keep bumping against these strictures of what we've put into place for hundreds of years, and that seems to be a recurrent theme that I heard through all of our three papers, but also throughout the conference as well.
I would sort of echo that and say that I think we've heard some new approaches to not just improving access through technology or through surrogates, but also to improving access. I love this idea of changing the way we do metadata, changing the way we describe these things and pulling them out, recontextualizing them for folks as well. I think government information is a wide and deep pool of ways that we could approach that as well. I think it would be a good set of source material for that.
I guess before opening it up to audience questions, my addition to talk about accessibility and increasing accessibility would go to some of the fundamentals discussed in the indigenization talk before this panel about genuine efforts to increasing research, genuine efforts to have better metadata are fantastic, but what about a field that's almost entirely white women, in which people of color leave the field at incredibly high rates, even once they've achieved jobs, when library school is predominantly white? Again, my question is always, am I creating a fantastic African-American database to be used by white students in their research? And I value those white students, but I also just question why is this important to them? Is that the goal I want to have? And I think to look at museums, there's a difference in how things are the point is display. And in those cases, an anecdote before moving to audience questions that I think reflects the possibilities. At National Museum of African American History, Smithsonian, I was talking to a head conservator after opening, and she told me that she has had to go and do conservation work on the paintings in the art galleries more than any other Smithsonian museum she's worked at, because people keep touching the paintings. And people keep touching the paintings because they feel ownership in that space. This is something that has that meaning for them. And we don't see that a lot in archives and libraries, and we don't do that work, particularly around African American communities. There are moves to do things like, because of national federal laws, to repatriate indigenous materials and to work with indigenous communities which are perceived as closed and perceived as having an opinion. We can say this community says this is sacred. we're not repatriating field recordings of African Americans made in urban communities, because that would be difficult work and they wouldn't want to talk to us and we would have to keep going back. And people that have done that work get burnt out because it's very difficult. And I think these are the questions that underlie this, you know, having a really great project at a place where the people that are represented in that project maintain minimal access is of an arguable worth.
Thank you for your comments. I'd like to make one slight corrective to that last point about not repatriating recordings back to African American communities. The Library of Congress's American Folklife Center holds vast collections of materials, specifically from the Alan Lomax collection. And the agency...
Could I ask you to stand up? It's really hard for us to see you. Thank you so much.
Sorry. Full disclosure. So I would say that there is a concerted effort by the Association for Cultural Equity to return cultural heritage materials back to communities of origin, in this case broadly, say Mississippi, Trinidad, in the Bahamas, where Alan worked. And this is not these are sustained efforts, but they're episodic as well, because the resources to make these trips are not necessarily within the reach of the institution. So there are these efforts, and I take your larger point to be that we're not looking towards those as anything except special projects, but there are efforts being made to repatriate cultural heritage recordings to communities of origin in African American source communities. And I think that the point is whether that's a sustainable effort across all agencies. That's not a question that I could answer, that it has to come from within each individual repository who can have the will and the resources to do that, it seems to me.
I guess to respond to that, acknowledging those projects, two things, and one sort of relating to the previous point, the 3 areas you named. One of those is an African American community. So the other, I mean, the Black diaspora is real, but specifically I'm thinking not only of something like Alan Lomax field recordings, which can be brought back to those communities, but things like a collector's group of papers that reflect African American history that were not, you know, that are owned by a collector. We don't think of we have that as the collector's name collection, that sort of thing. There's obviously, you know, ethnographic work and work that happens to talk back with communities. But again, even then I would trouble the notion of which communities we go to. We go to Gullah people, we go to specific Mississippi Delta communities that have a connection to the larger idea of historic African Americans versus urban Black communities. And, you know, it's an ongoing concern, but I do acknowledge those projects.
I realize that digital access to rare material increases their durability, but I wonder, is there a potential danger that digital objects will become a substitute for genuine access to the materials? I realize you're walking a fine line there, but question.
I'll step in my former role as a special collections, head of a special collections, and say most repositories find that when they digitize things, the demand for the physical goes up. And so it generates interest. And what the libraries, you know, repositories usually struggle with is, can they provide all of that access, again, with this preservation tension? They certainly want to make that physical object available to all researchers who come in, but if the use really, really spikes, then they sometimes have to reconsider how that physical access happens. But usually they tie together very well, and people who want the physical access will ask for it, and people who are using the digital objects, other folks may not be interested in the physical access just because they're so far away. That may not even be in their mind, but now they do have a kind of access. So there's sort of two things happening with that. Anybody else, want to add to that?
I have a story to tell about that. I'm Monica McCormick, and when I was in library school at the University of North Carolina, was a research assistant for the Documenting the American South project, which started out as digitized copies of slave narratives from the UNC's special collections, which had become physically damaged because they were getting so heavily used. So the library decided to digitize them, made a larger audience for them, and while I was a research assistant, I was answering the requests from patrons who wrote in and said, can't we get a print copy? Can I get something? You know, we did them in this very fancy HTML, which was impossible to print. So, and at the time I'd been working as a publisher for years before I became a librarian. I thought, why don't we make books again out of them? Which eventually the UNC Press did. So now those slave narratives have just been, you know, made into new print paperback books, which all those people can buy and create a little income stream to the project. It's a sort of virtuous circle, I like to think.
Could I just make the point that we can actually think of digital reproductions of rare materials as originals in their own right. On the one hand, they are metadata of rare materials, but they do all sorts of things that rare materials can't. And I think until the library world takes seriously the notion that its digital reproductions of rare materials are originals in themselves and present out to the public the proper metadata and conservation needs that they need, we're going to have a really genuine problem.
There's a hand here, and then...
Sorry. Bob Hauser, APS. This is a question for Scott Matheson. I'm just curious to know whether I was really taken by what you had to say, and I'm curious to know whether your community is aware of or involved with, in some fashion, the work of the Ryan Murray Commission, the Commission on evidence-based policy, and the recommendations that came out of that, and the people who served on that commission.
I don't think it's something we've directly looked at, though, through GPO's program assessments and things. The National Academy of Public Administration did a large program assessment on GPO's public access programs about 5 or 6, 7 years ago, and draws on a lot of that, though that's a good point to look more carefully at sort of evidence-based practices in other areas. I think the underlying piece for the materials that may fall into the gap between publications and records is really that capturing those, preserving them is what ensures access, so that then we can continue to produce evidence-based policy, science, and so on. So Reynolds Commission? Ryan Murray, okay.
Super, thank you for that.
Perhaps this is a naive question, because I'm not a librarian, just a citizen who's looking for enlightenment. But I'm wondering if there's, with the infusion of fraudulent data that comes through the social media, is there any evidence of that happening in libraries in Scotland? In other words, information that's being brought in from foreign powers to influence thinking and to try and generate a false sense of whatever agenda might be there for that power?
Can I just say libraries are full of fiction? Lots of novels. Sorry, go ahead.
Our library is a research library. We collect broadly and widely, try and restrict ourselves only in that we're looking for high quality publications regardless of point of view or whether they're fiction or nonfiction. I will say from the government information side, one of the hallmarks of GPOs, one of their pillars, is that they provide authentic information. They take that very seriously. They have a large system of public key infrastructure and chain of custody management for many of their documents, not all. So there is some protection there on that particular information source that's stamped as official U.S. government information. But I imagine there are definitely, especially as we start doing things like harvesting the social media feeds of government information or government agencies, I suspect there's definitely an opening for that sort of mischief.
I think with that, I'd like to have you join me in thanking our three panelists.